instead of attackers deleting the logs, they had a tool that was going into the logs and only deleting their IP addresses and the usernames that they were using. Basically, like in the absence of logs, you then know, right, that the attacker was in there and they deleted the logs. Basically just removing the attacker's entries. So it's kind of like a false sense of security for an analyst, because you're looking at that and thinking, oh yeah, I've scoped out everything and the attacker wasn't here. In espionage attacks, you have to scope out, and there's like a strike zone where you basically go for the remediation.
Welcome to another episode of Mandiant's Defender's Advantage podcast. I am your host, Luke McNamara. Joining me today, we have Jibran Ilyas, one of the consulting leaders here at Mandiant in our consulting practice. Jibran, great to be speaking with you today.
Thank you for the invite, Luke. Happy to be here.
So on our topic list today is something that I think we've probably touched on tangentially over the years on this podcast, but I don't think we've ever dedicated an episode specifically to that. And that is the topic of remediation. So when we think about incident response, and there's certainly a lot of preparatory work that we talk about, how organizations can position their security operations and policies and playbooks in such a way that if an incident does happen, they're in a good position to respond to it. We talk a lot about actual incident response itself, but the tail end, the back end piece of that, coming back from an incident, coming back from a breach, maybe a disruptive event, that's not something that we've spent too much time, I think, talking about. Again, at least we've not dedicated an episode to it. So that's what we're diving into today. Maybe just to kick us off, Jibran, when you think about the remediation phase, and I know this probably blends in with other parts of the incident response, breach investigation, but generally, how would you categorize that? What's typically being done? What does that involve when we're talking about remediation as part of an IR?
Yeah, great question. So the incident risk, so before the remediation, there's this incident response, right, which is like the fact-finding mission. So incident response, you could say, is more typical, or relatively more typical, because it has, you have a starting point, which is the system that is infected. And basically what you do is you analyze that system to see what was going on that system. Then you try to figure out how the threat actors got onto that system. And then also, what did they do after that system? Where did they go from there? So basically, you kind of go backwards and forward, and all the machines that come in that scope as part of that analysis, that you create a full timeline. And that timeline is basically your fact-finding mission. Now, remediation, it has a lot of logistics and different types of considerations. Like incident response, you could say, is a very technical sort of exercise. The CISO and downwards, that they basically handle. But then if you think about remediation, it's not just, the incident is not just an IT risk, it's an enterprise risk. So the decisions for remediation can include executive leadership. It could include board of directors. It responded to a really big incident earlier this year, where one of the biggest questions that kept getting asked in boardroom was, how do we achieve 100% confirmation that the attackers are not in the environment or not going to be in the environment based on the actions that we take? So typically that answer is difficult, and somebody recommended or suggested that, yeah, if you rebuild everything and replace all the hardware, then we can say something like that the attackers are not in the environment. And guess what? That suggestion was accepted, and they went about doing that, and it worked out great, because at the tail end, the statements that were coming from third parties, like like us, when we're writing attestation statements, we had more comfort in saying, yes, this server is rebuilt, therefore nothing bad is on it right now as of this and this date. So remediation basically goes, it's so if you have to sum it up, it's basically the decisions are made based on the risk appetite of organizations. And other than the risk appetite, there's also the threat profile considerations. So you always want to know who the threat actor is. Is it a nation state threat actor? Is it a cyber criminal? Is it a hacktivist? Based on that, your intensity or velocity of remediation will differ. Other than risk appetite, the threat intelligence on remediation is very, very important. So lots of stakeholders, lots of discussions. It is actually great to be part of remediation discussions because it's not just an outside expert deciding it. It's the internal organization based on their risks and based on their understanding of their business. That's what gets involved in the calculus.
Yeah, this is part of the reason I wanted to do an episode on this topic, is because I think that there is a lot that maybe doesn't get discussed around the nuances that come into play when we're talking about remediation. Because as you noted, doing during the actual incident response and the investigation, where you're trying to figure out which systems have been impacted, we'll talk a little bit about the nuances of, as you mentioned, the types of threat actors and the types of activity, right? If it's something that's more espionage in nature, where the threat actor is trying to remain undetected, it's maybe more surreptitious, maybe more patient, even in some cases, and then something more disruptive, brash, ransomware, wiper malware types of attacks. But there's all these different components that, from an investigative standpoint, you have to kind of take before you're in a position to make some of those choices and decisions around the remediation piece and what actions you are going to take. And that information gathering, that data gathering, that turning that data into intelligence, that takes some time. Some of the nuances around remediation also apply to the size of the organization that you're dealing with, right? The types of architecture that you're investigating. So maybe to jump into kind of that piece about the actual activity itself, walk us through some of the differences and some of the nuances that at a very high level, let's say you have one incident you are in charge of responding to and making decisions around remediation for, where we suspect or even know that it's an espionage threat actor in the environment, and then another situation in which it is a ransomware threat actor. Walk us through about some of those differences between how remediation you're going to approach remediation in those scenarios.
In espionage attacks, I think one thing that's very different from like the typical cyber criminal sort of attacks is that you have to really scope out the incident and the impact. Like, for example, like ransomware, the impact is known. Your network is inoperable. Your files are encrypted. But espionage, the one thing that takes time is what information that they were trying to gather. That could take a lot of time. The other very, very important thing is, before the remediation, you have to understand like how they came into the network, right? Because if you just start remediating without that understanding or reasonable understanding of that, you end up playing a lot of whack-a-mole. And that adds to so much frustration. Like, for example, you block one IP, or they come in from another IP, or or you delete their malware, then they bring an A grade malware that the world hasn't seen before. Lots of times you have in espionage attacks, you have to understand a reasonable amount of the attacker lifecycle, from infiltration to how do they gain privileges, how do they put persistence in the network, what were they doing for internal recon, which ones are their staging servers, that you need to understand, how are they aggregating the data, what malware they're placing for automation, what living of the land tools that you're using, because based on that you need to curate your detections, because normally living of the land tools may not be part of your detections. And you have to understand what type, how are they exfiltrating the data, are they just going straight up, or they kind of have a mesh network inside your network where they go through to exfiltrate the data. You also have to understand what sort of anti-forensics steps they're taking, so that you have on a watch out. Like, one really good example I had was, instead of attackers deleting the logs, they had a tool that was going into the logs and only deleting their IP addresses and the usernames that they were using. Basically, like in the absence of logs, you then know, right, that the attacker was in there and they deleted the logs. But if they are, I think it was kind of called like white cat, like log remover or something, and it was basically just removing the attacker's entry. So it's kind of like a false sense of security for an analyst, because you're looking at that and thinking, oh yeah, I've scoped out everything and the attacker wasn't here. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that in espionage attacks, it's you have to scope out, and there's like a strike zone where you basically go for the remediation. And the other very very important thing is that these espionage attacks may be going on for several years, and an average organization may have logs for 1 year max, or 2 years max, or 3 years. Some organizations can have that. But if the compromise was going on beyond 3 years, then you basically don't have good facts to make those decisions. And that's always hard, because you have to provide some sort of comfort to your leadership and your customers and your internal employees that yes, whatever the remediation actions that you're taking are good enough. But without reasonable facts, it becomes really really hard. Now, the on the other side, the cyber crime or ransomware, it also has a lot of challenges, because while the impact is known, and the impact is most likely exfiltration of data before encryption, and then encryption of data, so your network is inoperable. But think about this, and for the past couple of years, what we're seeing is that attackers are just going to like ESXi boxes where the guest, machines are housed, the volumes are there, and they just encrypt that. So you can't even get to the operating system to go read the ransom node or do a forensics on those boxes to understand how they came in, and what they did inside the network before encryption. And sometimes they even lock out that ESX system. You can't even go in to do, kind of like your Linux forensics, to understand what they did inside that ESXi box before encryption. Think about this: all of your identity management applications, your domain controllers are encrypted, your identity management portals are encrypted. So before you even try to do remediation, you have to recover, like you have to figure out how you're even going to have systems to do remediation on. And it gets very very painful, because of the prerequisites and so many different third parties involved, who may not understand or may not have a full appreciation of a full scale ransomware attack. But yeah, while the impact is known and you can start containment right away, because attackers know that that the network is going to be encrypted, so you're not playing that chess game that you play in espionage. But it's hard with broken systems. Like if your domain controller is broken, it takes a lot to recover.
What would you say is the typical? I mean, I imagine it varies probably wildly, but if you had to put numbers on the typical time frame between when an incident response investigation begins and when you can start doing the early parts of remediation for both a cyber espionage incident and from a disruptive ransomware attack. I mean, is that typically weeks, months that you're looking at for both of those? I mean, in the case of if you're not able to readily identify, going back to the cyber espionage example, initial infection vector, right? What was patient zero? Because you lack the proper logging, your confidence that that threat actor truly has been remediated off of the boxes or assets that that they touched, that they moved around, and have kind of gained access to within the environment. That seems to have an impact on kind of going to your example of like what level of confidence you're going to have that you've truly kicked the attacker out. So in terms of kind of remediation, we'll get into some of the aspects of that in terms of how long that can run. But when you can start the early parts of that for both the espionage example and the ransomware, is this typically a matter of like weeks, months, depending on the nature of the activity?
Yeah, I would say the ransomware one, you could start at least the containment part. You could say within a couple of days, as you have some understanding, or even right away. But the espionage remediation could take months. So if I had to put a number by for ransomware remediation, I would say, within 10, 11 days, you gain a reasonable understanding. By say end of week three, I would say more likely than not, you're 80% there. So like if you apply that 80-20 rule, people just go for it. So yeah, so for ransomware, I would say 10 days to 21 days, right? That area. And espionage, oh my God, could take months. I mean, we've done investigations where we've gone for months, and feels really bad to tell the client that, yeah, we're still not there yet. We're still scoping, but these espionage actors. So you have to understand like who these espionage actors are, right? So they're very well funded, and they're very mission oriented. Their motto is that slow and steady wins the race. So they go slow, and sometimes when we're in the environment, they adjust, they adopt. It's not a what, it's a who, right? So basically, what they're doing is they're watching us. Let's say they know Mandiant's coming in. Where they're gonna go. Okay, well, let's kind of lie low for right now. Let's become the sleeper cell, and then when Mandiant leaves, and they know there's we're not going to be there forever, sometimes even do some cleanup and become dark, like they become a ghost, and then they come back. So when we're doing espionage investigations, sometimes it could take months before you have that comfort. And to be honest, sometimes when the logs are not there, we tell them that, look, we're going to do this remediation, but don't assume that they're out of your network. You still have to start like a threat hunting program. You could do it internally, we could train you. But if you want us to come in every month, do a threat hunt based on our latest and greatest threat intelligence of the threat actor, we're happy to do it. So sometimes people sign up for managed defense. Sometimes people sign up for like these periodical threat hunts, because what I want people to understand is that remediation is not that golden word that when you start remediation, you're gold. Even after remediation, some threat hunting could take place to keep having some comfort that you're detecting the latest and the greatest of the threat actors.
You started touching on this, but maybe dive a little bit more into how the architecture of the organization, how that impacts things from a remediation standpoint. So whether you have maybe more traditional on-prem networks or environments that you're doing remediation in, more cloud-based, hybrid, obviously very large, multinational organization is going to have complexities to it. Organizations where maybe they've been very active in the M&A space, and so they have some, partially integrated entities that they've acquired, but those networks look maybe a little bit porous. And these all are certain nuances or complexities I would imagine in terms of the remediation aspect. So maybe talk to kind of how you've seen architecture play into the difficulties or ease with which you can do remediation.
Yeah, no, this is an excellent question, because one of my first questions that I ask in a scoping call is that, is your environment on-prem or cloud? And usually I'm praying really hard that it's not on-prem, or at least, not everything is on-prem. There's some hybrid there, because, the last few big ones where I have to do on-prem. Look, I'll tell you, it reminded me of my earlier years, like when I began the incident response career. Like it took me back to 2007 when I used to like get hard drives from like Best Buy, Walmart, and then go on client sites to image systems. So I had to do this for a big on-prem environment where attackers encrypted everything. There was no remote connectivity to those systems, so we had to go on site. And even on site, like internally, we couldn't get to those systems. Like we had to actually go into the data center, right, and bring our hard drives. I made so many Walmart runs to get the hard drives, plug in, image the systems manually, and then start investigations. Whereas in cloud environments, you can just dump a snapshot of the system that you want to investigate, and you could start your fact finding mission there, which is the investigation part of it. And remediation is also so much easier because you're spinning up these cloud instances, applying your remediation patches, your remediation scripts. But on prem, you have to be there because you're kind of spinning up those systems manually and then doing the remediation one by one, and that is painful. So yeah, if you ask that cloud versus on-prem, I always pray that the new cases that we got, they're on cloud. Now you mentioned something else that was interesting. These multinational or like really really big organizations that are acquiring companies left, right, and center. Like the remediation is so much tougher there as well because they don't have a uniform architecture or uniform technologies either. So let's say, we create a script for, a certain type of technology. It may not work for so many companies that they've acquired. The investigation is not easy. Like I'll tell you this, one recent incident that we had to log on to so many different sim technologies. Like we had to learn so many different sim technologies because the acquisitions, they were using so many different kind, and we had to learn. We didn't have a central timeline, so we had to do a lot of manual work to make sense of what data and what timelines we were studying. The more uniform you can keep your network, the easier the remediation is. If you have like so many flavors of OS, EDR, SIM, and all security technologies, it becomes harder and harder. You get there, but it just takes a lot more time. And the other thing, your point about like what could make it quicker. A lot of people do tabletop exercises, but either they're doing like executive version of it, which is like 2 hours and done, or if they're doing executive and technical tabletops, they're separate. I think what really helps is when technical and executive tabletops, they're done on one scenario, because then you really understand the decision making that's coming from IT, like how well that's taken by the enterprise risk people, and all the other stakeholders like PR, legal, security team, the IT team, because we sometimes forget all of these stakeholders, they're going to have a say in an incident. You can't just take security team's recommendation and go with it, because IT might say, "Oh yeah, it's easy for you to say go remediate or go rebuild like 100 laptops. I don't even have 100 laptops sitting around." Or legal might say, "Oh no, that's a really bad idea. That could get us a class action lawsuit if we did that." Remember I was saying like in some remediation, you might want to wait for like a strike zone for remediation. And if that question is posed to the executive leadership, they'll say, "Oh yeah, my consumer data is leaving, and you want me to wait for like a regular strike zone? I'm not doing that. That's gonna not look good when we're on the stand." So yeah, those tabletop, they need to be carefully planned with all the stakeholders. So at the time of the incident, it's not the first time that they're actually meeting. When we show up for investigations on site, we often see like so many internal people like saying nice to meet you in person, or nice to this is the first time that they're meeting, and we go, oh my god, this is going to be a tough one. That tabletop's a very very important point there.
I think, for folks maybe that aren't familiar again with this concept of remediation, hopefully by now they're getting a sense of it's a very nuanced and can be very complicated, and in many cases not very straightforward how you proceed with the remediation component of this. I'm curious, you've touched on this a little bit, but maybe diving further into the non-technical components of remediation. because it does tie back into the business organization and the processes that are going on across the enterprise, which might accelerate or slow down how you approach remediation. I think one thing, listening to at MWise this year, Charles's panel with several organizations that have been through high profile incidents, one takeaway I had from that is it's very much a marathon and not a sprint, right? When you're talking about something that can be weeks and months into rebuilding systems and regaining trust of your customers and partners. So all this kind of to the point around the non-technical components of remediation. What are some of the things that you've seen that are kind of takeaways for you about how organizations should think about that phase of the incident response?
I think the non-technical, you're absolutely right. It doesn't get talked about a lot. But I think one big theme that when I walk into a war room, and sometimes, look, I'll be honest, sometimes I don't feel like I do anything technical at all. I feel like I'm a therapist on site because I start with saying, hey, look, all of us humans are going to be taking care of this thing for weeks, months, perhaps. We have to be considerate to the humans because the fatigue and burnout and health impact is so real. And I've seen that firsthand. People getting hospitalized, people, I've seen people taking an IV and talking to us. And I'm like, why are we talking to them when they are in that scenario? So I think the first and foremost thing, you have to understand that it's going to be a marathon, just like you said. And then it's humans, they're not robots. So these are the people that you have invested in, sometimes for over a decade or 2 decades. These are the people that you want to keep in your organization. These are the people that you can't afford to lose, especially in the middle of the incident. These are the people that you want to like your workplace. And so you can't say, yeah, we're on site right now. It's 9 o'clock. You've got to stay as well. I think that that's where it all starts with. You have to understand that people have lives, and the thing is, if you think about this, after a certain point, like let's say you go on a sprint for 3 days. After that, your decision making is going to be very poor. You can't survive. You can't be making good decisions if you're tired, if you have lack of sleep, if you're not eating food right, if you're not drinking, if you're not hydrated. All these things are actually, it's a biology, but it's very real, right? It plays into the success of an incident response.
And you have all the folks who are involved in decision making who still have to operate the enterprise, operate the business. So not just the folks, in the SOC, in kind of the CISO's org, that this is their job, their primary function now is getting the system back up and running. But you may have folks from all other parts of the organization, in a hospital or a large manufacturing company or whatever the organization is, that they still have to run a business as best they can in this environment and are brought in, to kind of weigh in on some of these decisions. So that takes a toll on them as well.
That's true. Great point there, because the thing is, they're doing double work, right? They have their regular day job and they have to respond to the incident. So one thing that, when I'm going into more of the proactive engagements for prepping people for incident response, I say, then people give me like strange looks, right? But it's very important. So think about this: if you don't create a backup for you, like if you are a single point of failure, you're gonna crash at some point during the incident. So what happens then? Who takes over? Or like if you have a day job, right? Who else can do that day job for you while you take care of the incident? Building that redundancy, and sometimes people have these follow the sun kind of options when they're global. So it's important to offload some of your day to day, or at least train people to take care of them when there's crisis and there's other things to be done. So that when organizations have had that, we've had a great time responding to incidents, because I'll give you a scenario where, let's say it's a major hospital and we have to make a decision whether or not to bring down or shut down a critical system. If the person who's got to make that decision is sleeping and we're calling them, paging them, they're not waking up during that time, all of that advantage that we've taken over the attacker for say 10, 12 days, that could go out in a moment, because the attackers can just come back in and we have to restart the investigation. So you want to have 24/7 coverage, and hopefully it's not just you who gets to be woken up during the middle of the night. It's somebody else. So that thing is extremely, extremely critical. You don't want to be the bottleneck. You don't want to have all of those things dependent on you. And there's so think about like the mental health of the people who are involved in this. No matter how much practice you have in a tabletop exercise, you just can't match the intensity of a real incident. You can't match the emotions that are going on at that time. You can't match that or practice the fatigue factor. So there's a lot of strain in relationships. So I was talking about the physical health earlier, but think about if you can't go meet your spouse, you can't see your children, you can't be part of their birthdays or their special days or like very important practice or a game. It starts to build a toll on you. So those non-technical components of remediation are extremely, extremely critical. And again, one thing that I mentioned earlier is that if you take it as a sprint, yeah, you'll survive maybe 3 days, 4 days, depending on your stamina. But your decision making is gonna suffer. You have to make so many important decisions, right? And it's like if you have all the facts, right, the decision making is not that hard. But in a real investigation, right, like you have to make a lot of decisions week one when you don't have a lot of the facts. Like I said, sometimes it could take 3 weeks to gain 80% of the understanding of an attack, but you're making a lot of the critical decisions in the first 10 days. Making decisions without good facts, it's hard enough. And if you have lack of sleep and lack of like quality time, like I always tell people, hey, you need something to charge your batteries. Write a list of what that is. Is it watching TV? Is it going to your family? Is it spending time with your kids? Write everything down. And the management, you better be considerate about those things, because you want them to be 100% when they're actually responding to the incident.
So tying this all together, you've been a part of many different incident responses and doing the breach, the remediation in the wake of a breach. What have been some of the lessons identified, things organizations should proactively, think about doing prior to an incident that speeds in that remediation phase, or conversely, things to avoid, things that you've seen be bottlenecks or hinder the remediation component?
I always think that the war room creation and like who you put in the war room is extremely important. And typically, you would see a lot of IT folks, security folks there. I always like to recommend one of your best program managers or project managers to be at it. And a lot of people say, yeah, they don't understand tech, or they've never been part of this sort of program management, but they're important to keep the sanity, because there's so many things going on in an incident response engagement. And so remediation items are not standalone items, they have prerequisites. So if people are not keeping track of prerequisites, it adds so much frustration, because somebody might say, oh yeah, you were supposed to do that, and that person at the 11th hour or at the deadline hour may say, yeah, but I needed this thing from this person and they didn't have it ready, so I couldn't finish my task. So a project manager, and not just a project manager, an empowered project manager who has the command of like who has decision making powers too, or at least knows how to get those decision makers on the line when we need it. That sort of program manager is essential.
Not just having the right people in the room, but having someone and some mechanism to ensure that those pieces are all moving together, and that they have the authority to provide some level of direction for those resources.
Yep, yeah. Like if we need something, like let's say we need logs from somebody in UK, right? that program manager should know like exactly who to contact, exactly how to escalate, because it's not like a regular request. It's like a 5 minute before or 5 minute ago request. You need something right away. So you need somebody with that much empowerment that gets the task done. Like one of the biggest frustrations is people are working long hours, but the executives are not able to see the progress. So the program managers, their MO usually is to start create dashboards and create that visualization of where we are. IT folks, security folks may not have that skill or don't necessarily have that skill. They're just working to find facts, doing very geeky work to get to the facts. So that dashboard creation, having an understanding of where we were yesterday and where were you today, like is the needle going forward, that is extremely important for the people paying the big bucks, right? Like, I mean, incident response is not easy, right? It's 500, $600 an hour, if not more. The management, the board of directors, they want to see results. So project managers, play a huge role in getting us what we want and then keeping the needle moving, progressing. Other thing is purple teaming is a good idea, where, before the incident, you actually let red team attack your network and the blue team watch out to see what you detect, what you don't detect, and what learnings you need to apply to your cyber defense program. A lot of people, and look, I'll tell you, I think I'm batting at 1,000 on it. When I go in, people say, "Oh yeah, we have backups," or we think our backups will do it, so we won't have to pay the ransom because we're gold. But what they've tested with their backups is not a full enterprise-wide restore. They've done like one or two systems at a time. So imagine when they have to restore hundreds of servers at once, bandwidth constraints, and just technology being technology, that may not work for 100 systems, or it may be very, very slow, painfully slow, to the point that you go, okay, well, it's kind of like we have to say that we don't have the backups. It's going to be that small. So I see that a lot. While you're testing your backups, try the enterprise restore before you check that box that yeah, in a ransomware scenario, we're going to be fine because we have good backups and we have restored a full enterprise, somewhere. That's important. The last thing I'll say is that it's humans that you're dealing with. You have to make sure that somebody's looking out for them. Again, people laugh at me when I first say it. I say somebody in an organization, like wherever the war room is, they need to make sure that the people are well fed, they're hydrated, they have a lot of good dessert, ice cream, or cookies or whatever that makes them feel that they're valued. Because without those human considerations, people don't, may not really feel that they're valued. I feel like, so I'll give you like a very philosophical or a life belief that I have, which is when you give people ownership of a problem, magic happens. And that, when people feel like they're part of one mission and somebody's owning them, somebody's taking care of them, they give their best. And, you could have a problem and there could be like 4 or 5 different people want to lead it. But if they're not well taken care of, I bet you, like when you ask a question in a stand up in a war room, nobody's going to raise the hand. So the atmosphere, you kind of almost need a cheerleader who is taking care of all of this, morale. Because, if you feel like a mission, and we've done it for several big organizations that, you were mentioning earlier, it's like we got through because we felt that we were part of something special. We were part of saving lives. We were part of building or rebuilding America's healthcare system, or we're part of like restoring business operations or something that's really critical in the world. So you have to make sure people understand the mission of what you're going for. They're empowered. They have the right sense of ownership. Once you got those things, then it's kind of like orchestra, just playing, and it's like it's very poetic when people come together and work at a solution, and you get through, and then you remember those days, those war room days, for the rest of your life, and you create those very, very special bonds. And that's the fun of doing incident response. You create those very long lasting relationships, and feeling proud that you're part of something very, very special.
Well, I can't think of a better point to end it on. So we'll wrap it up there. But Jibran, thank you for sharing your insights and your experience with remediation. I think as we touched on in this conversation, there's a lot of nuances that go into it, and that component, that piece of incident response, I don't think it's discussed as much. It's not just an automatic thing. It takes a lot of time, depending on the nature of the incident. And so I think, hopefully, this will give folks some thoughts on things they can do proactively to prepare for, having to, if they unfortunately, find themselves in an incident, how they can prepare for this type of event. But thanks again. And yeah, great speaking to you today.
Thank you for the brilliant questions. I thoroughly enjoyed the session. Thank you, Luke.
Take care. Bye.